May it be a new week that is filled with blessing and goodness for us all. L'chaim. So it's interesting that amongst many other things, in our study of Rambam, we are finishing the laws of Tumas Saras, what's mistranslated as leprosy, but was a paranormal condition in the time when the Beis Hamikdash stood and miracles abounded. And a primary theme in the laws of Saras is the notion of quarantine, something that wasn't once part of our vernacular, our everyday language, but unfortunately is very much a part of our reality today. And today we make a siyum on the laws of Saras, and I'm soon making a siyum on my personal quarantine. And I hope we all get out of lockdown and quarantine very soon. So the final words in which the Rambam speaks at the end of the laws of Tumas Saras, which I want to start tonight's Zoombrengen with, he talks about the debilitating and the terrible effects of Lashon Hara, of evil, slanderish, and gossip-mogging speech. And he talks about the notion of it being a slippery slope. He says it starts by making fun of ordinary people. Eventually it goes to making fun of Torah scholars and even of prophets. And in the end he says, these are the same people who stand against Hashem himself. And the Rambam finishes off, of course, in a positive note. And he says that this is all about environment. He says if you engage in that kind of environment, then this is sichas harishayim. This is empty, vacuous, wicked, and self-serving speech, shegerem Islam, which is caused by yeshivas kronos, by loitering and hanging out in empty places. Yeshivas knesiyas lamei haaretz, people who are empty or devoid of content. Or yeshivas bati mishtois im sheisei shecher, hanging out at the bar. Nobody's doing much of that these days. Aval sichas, that's a silver lining. Aval sichas kshei Yisrael. However, the talk, the conversation of those who behave appropriately, the appropriate ones of Israel, they focus on words of Torah and on the ideas of wisdom, and they have intelligent, meaningful speech. Therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Oizer al Yadon u'Mezakos, and Hashem is right there at their side, and He makes them meritorious. Shenemar, as the last of the prophets, Malachi, who the Gemara thinks could even be Mordechai, but assumes in the end it is Ezra. But he is considered to be the last of the closing of the prophecies that Malachi says in the 3rd chapter, Az nidbru yirei Hashem ish el reyehu. Then those who live a life of meaning and of reverence towards Hashem speak to one another, and obviously they're not talking Lashon Hara, these are good people. Vayakshev Hashem, Hashem listens in, Vayishma, and He hears, Vayikosev Sefer Zikaron Lefanov, and this is recorded before Hashem, Leyirei Hashem, for those who revere Hashem, Alocheshev Eshmoi, for those who give honor and hold Hashem in high esteem. So essentially we're told that when we take the time to invest the gift of life properly, and we make the toil and effort to use speech as Hashem intended it to be, that Hashem participates in our conversations, and the Rambam interprets that as Hashem being there to help, to aid, and assist us in being successful. That concludes the laws of Tumas Saras with Hashem's help, and hopefully soon we will be concluding not only quarantine but lockdown altogether. It should be noted that at the beginning of Chodesh Adar the schools are going to be opening in Ontario, and I think that nothing is by accident. And I would like to say l'chaim to all of you with the prayer that Emertz Hashem next Shabbos, which will be the first Shabbos in Chodesh Adar, that we should be back in shul again, not at limitations of 10 people, but at least 30%, the way we had it before, and even better. And the numbers should drop. We should hear and share good news, and Emertz Hashem all be safe and secure. And Chodesh Adar, which is a Mazel Dika Chodesh, the time of Nepach Lahem. Last year, Chodesh Adar is when everything turned inside out for us. Who knows if there weren't hidden blessings, and maybe Hashem was protecting Israel from all kinds of machinations that our enemies had, and maybe that's why the world was turned inside out. Who knows? But now we ask that Hashem turn things inside out again, and Chodesh Adar should be the month in which we see miraculous deliverance, b'chlal u'befrat, broadly speaking, and also in our own personal lives. So l'chaim, l'chaim, l'chaim. So I want to dedicate this Zoombrengen to the holy memory of Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Twerski, Harav Rav Romishu Eshel Bereb Yankiv, Zechirnu Levracha, whose Shiva will be coming to a close in several hours in the land of Israel. A remarkable individual whose feet were firmly planted in two worlds, the worlds of Torah and Chassidus, and conversely, the worlds of medicine and the secular world. And he bridged these two worlds in an extraordinary way, which has a lot to do with Parshat Yisro, as I spoke in the class that I delivered in his memory at the first night of his Shiva on Sunday evening. So Rabbi Twersky was actually the second cousin of the Rebbetzin. And that's because Rabbi Twerski's bloodline, he traces himself back ben achar ben to the eldest disciple of the Maggid of Mizrich, whose name was Reb Nachum of Chernobyl, whose last name is Twerski. But he's also descended of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, and the Mittel Rebbe, and the second son, the son of the Alter Rebbe, who became the second Rebbe. And the story goes like this: there was one Shabbos where the Alter Rebbe showed up in Chernobyl. Chernobyl was famous in the Jewish or Hasidic world long before the reactor melted down. That was the seat of a major school of Hasidus, the Twerski family, and the many illustrious tributaries that came from Chernobyl. And the Alter Rebbe shows up at the door of his good friend, Reb Nachum, his elder esteemed colleague, Reb Nachum, the eldest disciple, and the Alter Rebbe being the youngest disciple of the Maggid of Mizrich. Reb Nachum was very surprised to have the Alter Rebbe join him on this Friday afternoon, but very pleased, and he assumed that the Alter Rebbe would share words of Chassidus in his unique Chabad way at Friday night. So Reb Nachum said to the Alter Rebbe, please, teach Chassidus. And the Alter Rebbe said, no, it's not necessary. And so Reb Nachum led the Tish, or Fabreng, as it was on Friday night, as he always did. And then on Shabbos morning again, Reb Nachum asked the Alter Rebbe to speak, and the Alter Rebbe politely demurred. And the same thing happened at Sudash Lishit. Comes Motzie Shabbos, Reb Nachum says to the Alter Rebbe, I don't understand. Why? I'm very honored that you're here with me for Shabbos, but why did you come? So the Alter Rebbe said, do you have Malav Malka? Do you have a meal after Shabbos? And Nachum said, certainly. And the Alter Rebbe said, do you make a point of drinking from water that's drawn from a live well, a stream, on Saturday night, as is the custom? And Reb Nachum said, yes. And are you going to get water? And he said, yes. The Alter Rebbe says, good. I'd like to have a conversation with you. So he said, let's have a conversation. He says, no, let's go together for a walk. It's a private conversation. They went to draw water, and the next morning when people were coming to shul at about 6 a.m., when dawn was coming to the town of Chernobyl, they could see two figures in animated conversation with a bucket of water next to them. And as they came closer, they saw this was Reb Nachum of Chernobyl and the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi, who were in animated conversation the entire night long. Nobody knows what the content of that conversation was, and nobody knows why it is that the Alter Rebbe chose to visit Chernobyl and what he wanted to accomplish. Here's what we do know. As day was breaking, the Alter Rebbe said to Reb Nachum, there was a tradition in the house of the Maggid that Mashiach would descend from the eldest disciple or the youngest disciple. So the Alter Rebbe said to Reb Nachum, let us make a shidduch of our grandchildren. And maybe this will accelerate the process of Mashiach's arrival. So Reb Nachum said, great. The grandchildren were all small. They were young grandfathers at the time. And the grandchildren were sleeping over at the Zaydi's house. So Reb Nachum brings the Alter Rebbe into the room where his grandchildren were sleeping. And he says, any of these grandsons that you see something special about? And the story goes, the Alter Rebbe went over to the different boys sleeping, and he pointed to this one child, and he said, I think this child is destined to marry one of my granddaughters. And his name was Yaakov Yisrael. He was the eldest son of Reb Mordechai of Chernobyl, who became his father's successor. And Reb Yaakov Yisrael, indeed, ended up marrying the Mittel Rebbe's daughter. And he became Rebbe in a town called Cherkasy. That is the bloodline of the Rebbetzin, because the Tzemach Tzedek's son ended up getting married to one of the daughters of Yaakov Yisrael Cherkasser. His name was Rav Yosef Yitzchak, And he is the grandfather of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And he's also the grandfather of the Yaakov Yisrael Chekasser. Yaakov Yisrael Twersky is the grandfather, the great-grandfather of Rabbi Abraham J. Twerski. So he is descended from the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, the Nachum of Chernobyl, the Motel of Chernobyl, the Yaakov Yisrael, and that's from his father's side. His mother was the daughter of the then Baba Rebbe, the Baba Rebbe before the war, who was known as the Kedusha Sin. He was murdered by the Nazis, Yimach Shema. So there's a very interesting story about the Kedusha Sin's father. The first Baba Rebbe was a descendant of the Tzanzurov. And it's a very interesting story in my family, but it's not well known. So I was sitting next to Rabbi Twerski, and I said to Rabbi Twerski, I would like to tell you a story about your grandfather, your great-grandfather that you never heard. So he said to me, how do you know I never heard it? I said, I'm pretty sure you never heard it. He said, okay, I would love to hear the story. Tell me the story. So I said to him, my mother's mother was the daughter of the last shochet of Mattersdorf. Mattersdorf was a very, very well-known and highly respected town in Hungary. And there were 7 communities that were 7 small shtetl that Mattersdorf was considered to be the chief city, so to speak. Amongst these 7 shtetl, all the shtetl associated with Mattersdorf, and the Mattersdorfer Shochet was the Shochet for what was known as the Sheva Kilas, these 7 communities. The Mattersdorfer Rav was the Rav for the 7 communities. My Elter Zayda, my great-grandfather, my Babi Hecht's father, Rabbi Baruch Greenot, was the last Shochet of Mattersdorf. And when the Nazis came to power in Austria, and there was an Einschluss, I think that part of Hungary was even part of Austria, and the Austro-Hungarian border was right away co-opted by the Nazis, and the persecutions began. We have a picture of my grandfather with his flowing, blonde beard with a little bit of gray in it, sweeping the street with an armband with a Star of David, along with other prominent members of the Mattersdorf leadership. And there's an SS man pointing a gun at my great-grandfather. And you see him sweeping the street and being denigrated. Then later he was taken by the Nazis. He was beaten literally black and blue. And the community decided that probably this would be, as things had been in the past, difficult years, and that the leadership was going to be persecuted. So they collected money amongst themselves, and they decided to send away the Rav, and the Sheikhet, and the Rosh Hashiva, and the Parnas, and they said, go to America for a year or 2, and then you'll come back. And that was the plan. That was the plan. My grandmother was a 16-year-old girl, and she left with her younger brother and older sister to go to America for 2 years, and then to come back to Europe. But of course, everybody knows that there was nothing to come back to, unfortunately. My Elter Zayda was a sheikhet, and a well-known sheikhet, and he wanted to shecht in New York, in America, but there was no glatt kosher shchita. It's a long story, but the Jewish mafia, if you will, kind of had co-opted the shchita, and people who were Yirei Shamayim, people who took Yiddishkeit seriously, did not eat meat. In fact, I know from my grandfather Hecht told me that his family grew up, he never tasted a piece of meat. The meat was unheard of. Chicken you could bring to a local sheikhet, but there was no glatt kosher meat in North America. And he was the Mattersdorfer sheikhet, and it's a long story, maybe for a different Matzah Shabbos, of how he managed to, so to speak, to break this cartel. He was very melodious and musical, and he sang to them, and he finally said, let me shech just one animal. And they let him shech to one animal and a second animal, and that's how glatt kosher shchita started. So the story I told Rabbi Twersky is that my great-grandfather, Rabbi Baruch, was the son of a rabbi whose name was Eliyahu. And this Eliyahu, he was the only son of his father from the second marriage. There was a first marriage, and we don't know what happened. That whole family was wiped out in the war. We have no connection. But the second marriage, my great-great-grandmother had several miscarriages in a row. So Rabbi Eliyahu was from a Galicianer living in southern Poland. He went to his Rebbe, Reb Shlomo of Bobov, and he wept before him. He said, I married this second marriage, and we're having so much grief. So we lost 3 children in a row. Every time the pregnancy comes near term, my wife miscarries. So the Shlomo Bobov said, Azoy, really, the next time she becomes pregnant, he says, let her come to my house, and she will live in my house, and she will have a baby. And so it was. Rabbi Eliyahu came with his wife, who I'm embarrassed to say I don't know what her name was, and she was pregnant, and she lived in the Baba Rebbe's home for the duration of her pregnancy, and the baby was born, and that was the only child she ever had, and that is my Bubby's father. That was Rabbi Eliyahu Greenot, the first Glat Kosher Shochet in America. How do we know the story? My great-grandfather passed away at a very, very young age. He was mid-70s. I remember him. I remember him the last Purim of his life, but he passed away several months later. And his funeral had a surprise visitor. The Baba Rebbe from Borough Park, who was named after his grandfather, Reb Shlomo Baba, showed up at the funeral. And my father told me that he went over to the Baba Rebbe, was very surprised. He said the Baba Rebbe came actually to the cemetery, and he was present at the burial. And he said to the Baba Rebbe, why are you here? Like, we didn't know that my great-grandfather had a closeness with the Satmaruv, with the Tzelmarov, but he didn't know that he had a connection to the Baba Rebbe. So he said to him, I'll tell you why. When I came to America, he said, a Holocaust survivor, I was broken in body and in spirit. And the first one who came over to me and gave me money to help support me, to put my life back together, the first one was the Shochet, Rabbi Baruch Greenot. And he said, I remained eternally grateful to him. He was the first one who came to me. And I asked him, he said. I asked him, because he wasn't a wealthy man at all, and he gave me a significant sum of money. I asked him, why are you coming to me? The Baba Rebbe was a young man. He was a young man. His older brother was murdered in communist Russia, and nobody, he was a survivor, broken in every way at the time. And my great-grandfather said to him, I am alive thanks to your grandfather, and now is my time to repay the debt. And the Baba Rebbe said to my father, that's why I came to this funeral, because I never forgot that kindness, and I wanted to participate and say goodbye to a man who gave me a sense of hope and life when I first arrived in the United States. So I told this to Rabbi Twersky. Rabbi Twersky, of course, is a grandson of the Kedusha Siyah, of the Reb Shlomo of Baba, the second Baba Rebbe's son. That was his mother's father. He said to me, thank you very much. He said, I never heard that story. But he said, I'm going to tell you a story that you never heard. And he started to talk to me about tzaddikim. And he said to me, who can fathom the ways of tzaddikim? Who could fathom how they live, how they function, he says. He says, I can't even imagine, he says. I have no understanding of it whatsoever. He said to me, there's a story with a great uncle of mine, or a great uncle, and I feel so bad, I didn't write this down, I don't remember the name. It was one of the Chernobyl Rebbe's, one of the Nachman Chernobyl's grandsons, who didn't become a Rebbe. And his brother was a Rebbe. But he wasn't a Rebbe, he was the brother of a Rebbe, but he was known to be a tzaddik. And a man came to him, and he said to him that my wife had several miscarriages, and I'm asking you to give me a bracha, that my wife should have a baby, carry a baby to full term, and I should have children. So Rabbi Twersky said that this great uncle said to him, what do you want from me? I'm not a Rebbe. I don't give brachas. So he said, and Rabbi Twerski had a very unique way of telling a story. Just like his eyes would open up, and he leaned forward. It's very, very memorable. And he said to me, lean forward like this, and he said to me, the man said to this tzaddik, he said, Oib de kannst mir nicht helfen. If you can't help me, okay, I forgive you. You can't help me. Aber oib de kannst mir helfen. But if you can help me, und wilt mir nicht helfen, and you don't want to help me, ich bin euch nicht meuchel. I never will forgive you, said the man. Nicht auf der Welt, und nicht auf jener Welt. I will not forgive him, not in this world. I will not forgive him in the other world. I will never forgive you. Rabbi Twerski told me, remember he took his hands and he began to rock his head back and forth like this. And he said, this uncle, member of the family, this tzaddik who wasn't a Rebbe, he said like this, he said, Azoi, nicht auf der Welt, und nicht auf jener Welt. Not on this world, not on the other world. Azoi, said Rabbi Twerski, nicht auf der... He rocked his head back and forth, and he said to him, okay, tell your wife to come here. So Rabbi Twersky said this chassid brought his wife to this tzaddik. And there's a Mishnah, I'll paraphrase this Mishnah now, and I'll explain the Mishnah, what it means in a literal level, and then you'll understand how it's used euphemistically in the story. So the Mishnah in Masechet Avot tells us that there were 10 miracles that happened in the Beis HaMikdash on a regular basis. And one of them was Lehipilo Isha Mereach Besar HaKodesh. That it never happened that because of the pungent smell of the karbanot, the offerings, it was very, very powerful odors of karbanos being burnt. And sometimes this could bring on premature labor. And you're talking about the course of over 900 years, over 9 centuries. Millions and millions of Jewish people visited the Beis HaMikdash during the period of that time. There was many pregnant women amongst them. And the Mishnah says to us, never ever did it happen that a pregnant woman was miscarried or had premature labor triggered because of these odors, which is what you would call a statistic impossibility. Invariably, when you have such very strong smells and strong odors, this could cause something like that to happen. But it never happened. Never, ever, ever happened in the Beis HaMikdash. That's what the Mishnah says. So Rabbi Twersky said to me, the tzaddik, when the woman came, the tzaddik lifted his hand and he said, Shmekun! Smell. I guess there's like some body odor, whatever, smell. And he said, as she smelled, he said, Lo hipilo isha, a woman doesn't miscarry, mereach besar hakodesh, from the odor of sacred flesh, which is a euphemism. There's a notion, there's a medrash that talks about the Yitzchak Avinu, the Orach Chaim talks about it. He calls the Orach Chaim says about Yitzchak Avinu that he was called besar kodesh. A tzaddik is called sacred flesh. As if to say that from smelling his body odor, she would not miscarry. But in fact, Rabbi Twersky says to me, and she didn't miscarry. And she had healthy children. And then he said to me, does that make sense to you? He says to me, does that make any sense to you? It's totally off the charts, he said. It makes no sense whatsoever. How would that stop a woman from miscarrying? And I said to him, I don't know. He says, yeah, I don't know either. But tzaddikim are tzaddikim. And this is why we revere tzaddikim. He says we don't understand how tzaddikim have a special way with Hashem. And tzaddikim have the ability to bring forth blessing and to reveal our potential in a unique way. We don't understand it. He says we don't have to understand it. That's the fact. I want to finish off, since we talked about a euphemism in Mishnah, the first time that Rabbi Twerski was at Yechidus by the Rebbe, I believe was in the late 60s. And when he came in, he was already an accomplished person. He's a big Talmud Chacham and a Hasidic Yid and a psychiatrist. And I don't know if he had written his Peanuts books yet, but he was already well known. And when he walked in, he's a Benam Shel Kedoshim. He's the Rebbetzins' cousin, and he's a great grandson of the Baba Rebbe. I mean, he has lineage from all sides. So the Rebbe said to him, when he came into the Rebbe's study, was rare that the Rebbe should say, the Rebbe said, Zetzach, please have a seat. Usually in Yechidus, people would stand. So he said to the Rebbe, Ein yeshiva ba'azara elo l'malchei Beis David, which is a paraphrasing of a Mishnah. The Mishnah says that in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, only the royal house of David HaMelech would sit. So it's a euphemism. He was doing a play on words that the Rebbe's room to him was like a courtyard of a Beis HaMikdash. And Malchei Beis David is a euphemism because Man Malki, the Mishnah says, who is royalty, who is the Davidic house today, Rabbanan, our great leaders, our rabbis and tzaddikim. So he said, Ein yeshiva ba'azara elo l'malchei Beis David. And in other words, he did not consider himself Malchei Beis David, and he said, I'm not going to sit. So the Rebbe said, okay. And the Rebbe began to speak to him about a number of things, much of which he did not share. But one thing he did share, I heard this from Rabbi Yisrael Darren. So one thing that he did share from that Yechidus is, in a conversation about Chassidus, the Rebbe began to speak to him about psychology and psychiatry. And the Rebbe had a very, very wide knowledge of the medical terms and the ideas. And the Rebbe said to him that he believed it would be important to promote the works of Viktor Frankl. Now, Viktor Frankl was almost unknown at the time. Sigmund Freud was all the rage in the 60s. And the Rebbe, there's a number of stories of the Rebbe quietly pushing Viktor Frankl's thesis. Today his works are widely read. Man's Search for Meaning and other famous books. So Rabbi Twersky didn't know much about Viktor Frankl, and he expressed an uncomfortability about getting involved. He didn't want to. He expressed his reservations to the Rebbe. So the Rebbe said to him, "Do you need a malach to come from heaven and tell you that it's a right thing to do?" So when he heard these words from the Rebbe, he said no. He said, "For me it's enough when you have a Rebbe who's doima l'malach Hashem tzvois," which is also a paraphrasing of the Mishnah. It's enough when I have a Rebbe who is like an angel standing before me. And indeed, Rabbi Twerski did get in touch with Viktor Frankl, and he was one of the first to begin to promote his work. I'm not sure if he did it in a public manner or in a private manner, but he did work on starting to promote the work and the thesis of Viktor Frankl. And so I want to conclude with the notion the mind is a powerful thing, and psychiatry done right is about enabling people to overcome natural fears, anxieties, inhibitions, and weaknesses by strengthening their mind, by using their mind, by refocusing the mind on what's good and what's positive, and finding the courage and the stamina and the strength to overcome the fears and anxieties which can inhibit and overwhelm a person, so that we should be healthy and that we should be happy and we should be able to function right. And there are various times of the year when Hashem asks us to marshal the powers of our hearts and our minds in various ways. So high holidays comes along, we have to work on developing a sense of awe, a sense of reverence for Hashem, and then we move from that awe, we move into a sublime form of simcha, from days of awe to days of joy. Hanukkah is a time when we have to focus on darkness and finding ways to illuminate it. The month of Adar is the time, the key to unlocking potential during this month is joy. So much so that it's a halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. The Talmud Yerushalmi is of the opinion that one can read the Megillah and fulfill the mitzvahs of Purim during the entirety of the month of Adar. The Talmud Bavli disagrees, and of course that's the halacha. The Talmud Bavli introduces the idea that there are several days, 5 in total, in which the Megillah could be read, but that's only in a time when Jewish people are living in Eretz Yisrael, and it's Shanim Kitikunam. In our day and age, the Megillah can only be read on 2 days, the 14th and the 15th. However, the Talmud Bavli does say, Mishenichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha, that the joy of Purim goes far beyond the 2 days of Megillah readings and far beyond the days in which we can fill the actual mitzvahs of Purim. That is to say, Hashem has blessings for us always. And there are different keys to unlock that door. Now, the Avodah is Simcha. The Rebbe, I believe in the last Shabbat Mivarchim of Chodesh Adar, before his stroke, said that the Avodah, that the service to Hashem, that the toil and the effort that's placed on Simcha begins not on Rosh Chodesh Adar, but it actually begins on Shabbat Mivarchim. So we have a whole week, my friends, to work on being happy, to work on focusing on the good things we have in life. And I know this is not the easiest time to be happy, but it's a very important time to be happy. And if we will find joy in life and in Hashem's blessings, despite the challenges we're currently facing, Mertz Hashem, let us hope that our avodah, our efforts to find joy in every which way, and our efforts to fill our avodas Hashem, our davening, our study of Torah, our giving of tzedakah, our engaging with others in a kind, compassionate, and sensitive way, in a manner that all of this is punctuated and uplifted by joy, that's the key to unlock the brachas, the blessings for all of us. So l'chaim to you all, l'chaim, l'chaim. Hashem should give us the koyach, and we should respond appropriately. Mishenichnas Adar, the Rebbe says from Shabbat Mivarchim, which was today, and this is the Farbrengen that follows Shabbat Mivarchim, Marbim Besimcha. There's a famous Galiciana Taich, Polish Hasidic adage, Marbim. How do we increase? How does everything good increase? All good things increase now, Besimcha, through the Avodah of Simcha, through the Avodah of joy. May we hear good news. May we share good news. May the first Shabbos and Adar find us back in Shul without these limitations. May lockdowns be lifted, and may the joy be experienced by each and every one of us. And hopefully, as a result of our Simcha, we will merit to see the Simchas Olam, the eternal joy, brought to us through Mashiach Tzidkenu, B'mheira U'B'yameinu. Amen. L'chaim, everybody. L'chaim, l'chaim. And may the Aliyah of Rabbi Twerski Neshama have an Aliyah, and may it be a good to better for all of Klal Yisrael. Amen. L'chaim. All right, my friends. That's all she wrote for tonight.
It will be important to promote the works of Viktor Frankl.
Somebody's already... That's a playback. Wow, okay. All right, you can all unmute now, my friends. We can all...
There's a second play on Facebook, so...
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's why we
Shavua Tov, everybody. Agutavach, Afreilichavach, Amazlikavach. Besuris Tevis. Thank you, Jonathan and Tracy. Yashikoya for Havdalah. And may good news and happiness come from your home, Amir Tzashem. And good health for us all. Mentally, spiritually, physically, in every which way, emotionally. Yes.
I heard that Rabbi Twerski had a thing for recovery. Do you know anything about that?
Yes. He was very, very involved. The last years of his life, he devoted entirely to helping addicts recover. And he was singularly responsible for literally probably thousands of addicts who were rehabilitated. There's a colleague of mine who runs an organization in Florida, which is dedicated to this very important work. And Rabbi Twersky was very involved with him. I think it's called the Jewish Recovery Center in Florida, Rabbi Kessler. I know that during the last years of his life, Rabbi Twersky really declined, as a rule, almost all speaking engagements, and the only things that he spoke to and for were with regard to addiction. That became really what he dedicated his final years to.
All types of addiction, Rabbi?
I think so. I'm not very much aware of it, but I think so. I think primarily substance abuse, but I think really all kinds of addiction. And he found it to be tremendously important.
He started 2 clinics, Rabbi.
The Gateway or something, or you worked together with Gateway? Yeah, I'm not versed in the details, but he was very involved. I mean, I'm telling you, the last years of his life, he would really only speak to organizations that were involved with it. I once spoke to him at some point to come to Toronto for something, and he said to me, "I'm only going to come if it's addiction related." The only time he came to Toronto that wasn't addiction was for the Kedoshim, Rabbi Gabi and Rifki Holtzberg. He came for the Shloshim, but that he told me was an exception that he made, and otherwise he was only taking engagements with regard if it helped people that were helping with addiction.
Was there any reason why Dr. Twersky got into psychology or psychiatry? Was there anything related to the Rabbi or something?
No, I think he wanted to help people. And he found that was the way he could help people best. Anyway, I'm not an expert on his life. Maybe Howard knows more. Howard, do you know? Did you read?
Yeah, I read his obituary. In his obituary, it said that his father counseled many people, and he wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, but he felt the only way he could do that effectively is by going to medical school. So he decided to go the route of medical school, and
right, and he helped so many people. I mean, it's phenomenal.
But you're still live on Facebook.
I'm still live on Facebook. All right, let me unlive myself on Facebook.